Welcome to modules 22 and 23, which is all about human population. Couple things to talk about in terms of the overview of this module. You're going to be thinking about the different variations that go into how quickly a population grows, as well as the factors that influence births and deaths, and also age structures. In module 23, you're going to be really thinking about demographic transitions and how that's related to economic development and affluence, the alterations and variations within P, A, and T within our IPAT equation, and finally the challenges and benefits of urban and rural lifestyles and consumptions. The questions for you to think about in terms of these two modules are: what are the factors that cause populations to have demographic transitions from phase 1 to phase 4? What is Jevons paradox? And then finally, what are the impacts of and differences between global and local consumption? So population change. What do we need to know about population change? Well, recently, humans have experienced what we would call an R exponential growth phase within our global population. Approximately, we're adding 145 million people per year to births, while we're losing about 55 million to deaths. Now, countries' populations change as a reflection of both the differences between births and deaths, as well as immigration and emigration. Now, something that we will talk about during our three-country Jamboard project, but also future projects, is that there's no fixed carrying capacity for a population in regards to humans. We have the ability to implement new technologies, new practices, and new behaviors that can change things like life expectancy, mortality rates, and the density of populations, as well as how much energy or resources we are using. Things that can influence and have influenced our carrying capacity are things like artificial fertilizers, GMOs, and mechanical farming, pasteurization of food, which have led to huge yield increases and also huge upswings in world populations. In terms of life expectancy or mortality rates, we have things like organ transplants, antibiotics, chemotherapy, that all allow us to survive diseases that 50 or 100 years ago would have really slowed the upswing in this growth rate. Now, we use current population demographics to make predictions about where the population will go. So when we talk about future population growth, these different factors are really important that sort of give us a view into what might happen in the future for global or regional populations. Fertility, or offspring per female, is really important, and it's determinant of things like education, societal expectations, cultural values, employment. Child mortality is really indicative of the current population's healthcare, its access to sanitation, its access to adequate calories. Life expectancy is really based on average healthcare costs, environmental health, dietary choices, reproductive active demographic, which is the number of people having offspring, is really a reflection of prior generations' total fertility rate, but also things like immigration and emigration. So currently, the reproductively active demographic in the United States is quite large, but Caucasians are having a very low fertility rate. So the reason why the United States is continuously growing is due to immigration of non-Caucasian people that tend to have a higher TFR. And that's often driven by a gain or a loss due to economic, environmental, or societal factors. Economic could be a country goes into a depression and people leave that country. Environmental could be something like a drought or a forest fire or an earthquake. And societal factors or events could be things like wars or conflicts that cause people to leave or go to different countries. Now, we apply populations to these things called age structure diagrams, which we have seen before in class, but it's basically putting men and females in different age categories and looking at how those cohorts compare to each other from birth to death. We can see rapidly expanding to declining populations based on the size of these cohorts. Phase 1 tends to have really high fertility rates and very low life expectancies, while the opposite is true in phase 4. When the cohort of the offspring is smaller than the reproductively active cohort, that's when we tend to see compression and compaction of populations. Which brings us to the demographic transition model. The idea is that populations of any country tend to have 5 stages that begin with stage 1 and finish in stage 5. This is due to the logistical growth model, where carrying capacity and different density dependent factors cause differences in the growth rate as a reflection of deaths and births. The carrying capacity of resources can cause populations to slow growth, as well as economic or medical developments. Birth rates always tend to lag behind death rates in terms of, that actually should be opposite. Death rates tend to lag behind birth rates as a result of, sorry, I'm reading this graph wrong. Birth rates always tend to lag behind death rates in terms of falling rates as a result of westernized developments, such as medical care. So we'll talk about that in the next slide. And as populations reach phase 5, that's where we start to see oscillations between births and deaths, and populations can have small compactions or small expansions depending on various factors. So what are the phases of the demographic transition? The first is that there is really small growth rate, which we can see with the yellow line, due to both a high level of birth and death rates, but also a really small population of reproductively active people. We tend to see a concave triangle for that. Now, phase 2 is where we start to see death rates fall, while birth rates remain constant. This is our very rapid increase phase. This is often due to improving healthcare, vaccination, food, labor laws that protect children. The population is going to have its most rapid rate of increase in stage 2. Now, as more and more people are added to the population, the growth rate starts to fall as a result of older cohorts, which are increasingly larger, dying off. But this is also due to the fact that as countries enter stage 3, we generally have things like economic development and industrialization that add financial burden to having extra children and education costs. And then finally, we reach phase 4, where death rates equal birth rates, which cause a stable or contraction of the population, which can cause economic and some societal strains as a result. It's really where we see the plateauing off. We reach our carrying capacity. We might see future increases or decreases based on various factors, but for stage 4, we've really reached what we would call the societal, environmental, and demographic carrying capacity of a population. We're really not going to add more people or lose more people unless things in the society changes. Now, what are the consequences of the demographic transition? There are a few. The first tends to be education. We tend to see that in phase 2, 3, and 4, there's increased rates of women literacy and educational opportunities as well as employment, which tends to drive down the total fertility rate as women enter the workforce and have fewer opportunities to have multiple children. The second thing is that resource use per capita in income tends to increase. So as people make more money, the resource uses also tend to increase. And alongside that, we tend to have increases in wealth or GDP, which allows for a dramatic increase in consumption of some things that might be bad, such as eating more beef, burning more coal, driving more cars that have negative impacts, but they fuel growth. However, at a certain threshold of income increase, people tend to transition their impacts to more environmentally friendly purchases. Sometimes it really depends on the culture and the societal expectations, but people might switch to eating less beef and more tofu. People might transition to solar panels. People might start driving a hybrid or commuting with bikes. And this depends on very specific factors within a population, but the tendency is that you see a decline in consumption and pollution as you reach higher levels of income. Which brings us to the IPAT equation. The IPAT equation is basically that the environmental influence of a population really depends on the size of the population, It's affluence and it's technology. Affluence being consumption or repeatability of an action, and technology being the current available technology. So this really can be applicable to anything in terms of a size of the population, an environmental impact, or an action. And it's sometimes a little bit muddled. It's not all linear. For example, more and more people are flying every year, which is increasing the environmental impact of flying. Airplanes are really, really environmentally bad in terms of fuel exhaust, but also all of the resources that go into building airplanes. However, on average, each airplane is far more fuel efficient, so the environmental impact, it remains damaging. It's less than if everyone was still flying in planes from the 1940s. Which brings in the notion of Jevons paradox. This is a paradox that we see in almost every behavior in environmental studies. It's when technological progress increases the efficiency or reduces the pollution for some action or resource. But as a result of that efficiency increase, the rate of consumption of that resource rises due to increasing demand or lower costs. I would offer Ben & Jerry's Muforia ice cream as an example. They've reduced the calories, the cost of eating a full pint of ice cream, which means you're more likely to actually eat the entire pint of Ben & Jerry's rather than if you had a normal pint of Ben & Jerry's. So Jevons paradox is all about increasing efficiency, but then having the consumption increase as a result. So one way we can really break down the IPAT equation is talking about local and global consumption. We tend to see local consumption in rural environments where it's really driven by land use or forest clear cutting, such as the Amazonian deforestation. In Vermont, our local impacts tend to be farming, clear cutting forests, and then water quality issues related to those two main sources of resource use. Global impacts are often driven by material goods being exchanged from producers to consumers. So you go to the store and you buy a new iPhone. You go to the store and you buy some orange juice from Florida. You go to the hardware store and buy some timber from Canada. The global impacts tend to have less tangible effects in your local environment, but they're often far greater in terms of the overall impact. Urban developed areas like Burlington, New York City, Beijing tend to really have very few local impacts, but they do drive and have significant global impacts, which can hide or mask the ecological costs of our consumption. We go to our favorite restaurant and order a burger. We really don't have any tangible ideas of the environmental impact of feedlots. We fill our car with gasoline to drive to our friend's house. We don't see the oil refinery and the petroleum tanks that were responsible for creating all of that oil. So this has mixed impacts in terms of how we sort of connect with different behaviors and their overall environmental impact. Which brings us to our last idea of urbanization. Currently, in all countries, the percent of the population is increasingly becoming more and more urban. More and more people are moving to cities and suburbs as a result of economic employment and the decline of rural agrarian society. There's some positive and negative things as a result of that. First, waste and pollution tend to be larger and more concentrated, but also cities are very efficient in terms of having that pollution be lower per person. You do need to have adequate infrastructure to minimize this impact, which is why many developing countries have very bad environmental impacts. It tends to have increased sanitation risks, so clean water and clean food. There tends to be increased environmental pollution in terms of runoff. There's decreased health outcomes, and there's usually reduced economic growth. If you look in many magazines or environmental organizations, there's projections about how the future cities of the world will be our sustainable environmental savior. There's a lot of reasons why we could think of this closed-knit ecosystem as a way to reduce waste, to increase efficiency, and to really bring about some sort of new social contract between people that make our food, people that produce our food, people that produce wealth. However, there's many steps that need to go before we go from here to here, which brings us to sustainable development. The word sustainable is really flexible for various aspects of both human and natural systems. Does sustainable development include the idea of growth? More money, more people, more things? It really depends, and we'll get into those situations later on throughout the unit. However, in order for it to be considered sustainable development, a few things need to happen. There needs to be a lack of continuous environmental pollution growth with any growth in human population. Basically, that means if the human population gets bigger, our pollution levels need to stay constant or go down. We really need to see a reduction in the degradation of ecosystems and human wealth disparities. If you look over at this wealth global pyramid, 71% of the world's population is worth less than $10,000. But the aggregate wealth is $7.4 trillion. Now compare that to the top of the pyramid. There's only 34 million people that are worth, on average, more than $1 million. But that wealth is only responsible for a fraction of the total global wealth. Yet most politicians and government organizations don't really focus on the bottom part of our pyramid. They really focus on how do we best provide growth and resources to the top. And the improvement in quality of life for most at the bottom of the socioeconomic pyramid. This is where we really are going to achieve sustainable development in order to reduce resource use, pollution, and much more. And there's many global inequities that we need to figure out in terms of things like mortality rates, life expectancy, the number of years you go to school, the expected years of schooling based on your income, and also average income. Someone in the Central African Republic is worth $661 on average. The average Qatar person is worth $116,000. And I'll just leave you with this one notion about ecosystem pyramids. Remember, the health of an ecosystem is not driven by the apex predators. While they are important, they are very minute in terms of biomass and energy and the regulations of the environmental impact. If we want to think about what's going to drive sustainable energy, it's really going to be these primary producers and consumers that drive from the bottom up sustainable practices and sustainable resource use. How we incorporate things like energy and matter and recycling of goods, we'll be talking about in the next couple units. Have a great rest of your day. Hope this helped.